Hello. In this video, I'm going to cover some of the features that we covered in the written syllabus in the vertebral column and muscles of the back section. There are some features of the vertebral column that are actually a lot easier to see if you have the physical thing in front of you, the vertebral column in front of you. But failing that, there are some nice apps that we can use that have 3D representations of these structures. And so I'm going to use one on the iPad called 3D for Anatomy, just to show you a few of the three-dimensional aspects of the vertebral column and how the individual vertebra link together. Okay, so let's start with the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton is shown here in green and consists of the skull, the hyoid bone, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. Now, one interesting thing to note about this is that although these structures are in large part protective, the skull protects the brain, the vertebral column protects the spinal cord, the ribs protect the viscera in the thoracic cavity, there's something very important about the axial skeleton, and that is that if we look at the limbs, we'll see the upper limbs are attached to the scapula, and in fact the scapula is mostly attached to the body by muscles that attach to the vertebra. Similarly, the lower limbs are attached to the pelvis, and the pelvis is attached to the sacrum of the spinal cord, of the vertebral column. So the vertebral column not only protects the spinal cord, but is also the anchoring point for the upper and lower limbs, so it has this very important function. So now let's look at the vertebral column, and we'll begin by looking at a single vertebra. So let's isolate that. And let's see what parts we have of this vertebra. So down here we have the large vertebral body, and on either side are a couple of feet called the pedicles. Laterally there are two transverse processes, and then covering here is the lamina, and finally the spinous process. Now the pedicles, the lamina, and part of this spinous process and the vertebral body here define an opening which is the vertebral foramen, which is where the spinal cord lies. Now let's look at a few other features of this vertebra. We're going to turn it over like this. Now in this case it's orientated so that the head is at this end and the feet are down here. And I want to look at a couple of particular structures here. You'll see that there are some light-colored structures on the vertebra, and these are called facets. And they're locations, and I'll just zoom in here a little bit, they're locations where other bones will connect. So the first two facets we'll look at is this one, which is the superior articular facet, and one down here, which is the inferior articular facet. And so you can see that if we had a whole series of vertebrae here, the superior facet of one vertebra is going to be in an apposition and connect to the inferior facet of the vertebra down here. The other three facets that we have are where the ribs attach. There's the transverse costal facet. Remember, costal means rib, so this is where part of the rib will attach. An anterior costal facet and an inferior costal facet. So we can look around and we can see again where those lie, and you can see clearly here how these superior articular facets of one vertebra will link to the inferior costal facets of the adjacent vertebra. Let's go back to our axial skeleton and look at how some of these vertebrae are actually connected. So we'll choose a thoracic vertebra again, and we'll choose two thoracic vertebrae and the associated rib, and we'll hide everything else. So the first thing that we can look at here is how these vertebrae are attached to each other. And as I said, we have here the inferior articular facet of one vertebra, and it anchors onto the superior articular facet of the next vertebra. We can also see where the rib joins. So here is the rib, and we'll just zoom in on here. And again, you can see the three facets where the rib attaches. The inferior costal facet of one vertebra and the superior costal facet of the next vertebra. And then the transverse costal facet of that same vertebra. So there we can see how these vertebrae anchor to each other, and also where the ribs anchor in the case of the thoracic vertebra. So now let's just return to our entire skeleton again. This time we'll look at some other vertebra, and we'll choose some of these cervical vertebrae because they have a quite different structure. And the two vertebrae that we'll look at first are C1, which is the atlas, and C2, which is the axis. So we'll isolate these and see a number of structures on here. Now the first defining feature of C2 is this structure that sits up here called the dens. And you can see that the dens in fact articulates with this structure, with this facet on C1. So here, if we move this out of the way, here is C1. And you can see again where C2, the dens of C2, articulates. One structure I'd like to point out on C1 is this structure here, which is the superior articular facet, but you'll see how large it is compared to the superior articular facets on, for example, the thoracic, because this is where the skull sits. So the occipital condyles of the skull sits on these facets. So you can see they're large, broad, flat facets, and in fact the skull can rotate on these. And also C1 can rotate here around the dens on C2. And it's these two movements that allow us to rotate our head from side to side. Before we leave these two vertebrae, I want to point out one other feature, and that is if we look at the transverse process, if I could keep it still, if we could look at the transverse process here, you'll see there's a foramen in there called the transverse foramen. And this foramen is characteristic of all the cervical segments and is where the vertebral artery passes through on its way to the brain to supply blood to some part of the brain, and that we'll cover in another part of the course. So this time I'd like to look at several vertebrae, and in particular how the cervical vertebra transitions to the thoracic vertebra. So here we have cervical vertebra 6, C6, C7, and we transition to T1 and T2. So you can see one of the defining features, again, of the thoracic vertebra are that they have ribs attached to them here, while the cervical vertebra do not. And the other difference is, if we look in a little bit more magnification, the transverse processes of these cervical vertebrae have a transverse foramen, and in fact the vertebral artery will come up through these foramen to supply blood to the brain. Let's go back to our whole skeleton again. So this time we'd like to look at the lumbar vertebra, which we'll choose one down here, which is lumbar vertebra 3. We will isolate that. And we see the same structures that we did in our thoracic vertebra. We have the body, the pedicles, the lamina, the transverse processes, and the spinous process. If we look from the side, we have the superior and inferior articular facets, but you'll notice that there are no facets here for the ribs because the lumbar vertebra do not have ribs attached to them. So this is a defining feature of the lumbar vertebra. Basically, you can tell it's lumbar because it doesn't have a transverse foramen, so it's not a cervical vertebra. It doesn't have the costal facets, so it's not a thoracic vertebra, so it has to be a lumbar vertebra. Let's look at our skeleton again. And this time we will concentrate on this segment here. Now the sacral segments are fused together into one large structure called the sacrum, and the coccygeal segments are fused together to form the coccyx. So these last two, the sacral and coccygeal segments, vertebra, are fused into two solid bones. Now, before we leave this, there is another feature that we need to talk about, and I'll zoom in here. You'll notice that where these two ribs, where two vertebrae come together, not two ribs, two vertebrae come together, there's a small gap. This is the intervertebral foramen and is important because it's the location of the dorsal ganglion. This is where the spinal nerves emerge and the dorsal ganglion is located. Finally, I'd like to look at another feature of the vertebral column that is very important. So far we've talked about the vertebra as individual bones, and indeed they are, but to function they must be linked together in some way. And they're linked together firstly by these large structures here, the intervertebral discs, but in addition they're linked together by a number of ligaments. And we'll just quickly take a look at these ligaments. Now, running along the top, or along the posterior surface, is a ligament called the supraspinal ligament, and joining these all are the interspinous ligament. Now, in this particular software, they haven't made a distinction between the supraspinous ligament and the interspinous ligament, but although they have it drawn in, they actually highlight it all at once, so we're going to highlight it all together here. On the anterior surface, we have another long ligament that connects all these vertebrae together, and this is the anterior longitudinal ligament. There are some lateral ligaments here which we don't concentrate and which I haven't put into the syllabus, so we're just going to hide those because we won't deal with those anymore. These structures here are very interesting structures. They're joint capsules and they cover the superior and articular facet, and they're called zygapophyseal, which is a real mouthful there. Zygapophyseal, try it again. Joint capsules, and if we hide those, we can see here are the superior and articular facets of the two vertebrae. Now let's hide one of these vertebrae, and what we will see down here is the posterior longitudinal ligament. And you can see we had the anterior longitudinal ligament running along the anterior surface of the vertebral bodies, and here we have the posterior longitudinal ligament running along the posterior portion of the vertebral bodies. One other ligament is this small ligament here, the ligamentum flavum, and there's a ligamentum flavum up here. I'll just circle those here, and they again join adjacent vertebra. So this series of intervertebral discs and the many different ligaments hold the spinal cord, or hold all those bones, individual bones, vertebra, together to form one complete, very solid spinal cord. A vertebral column, I beg your pardon. So we'll go back to our axial skeleton. So that is a brief overview of the vertebral column and the bones that make up the vertebral column.